Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you with us for this follow-up discussion group from the April session with Dr. Richard Waugh that was called Human Impact 1, Drought, Flood, and Sea. We're glad you are able and willing to take the time for this important subject. Now, we always start with our vision, which is the sustainable flourishing of life for all. And by all, we mean all people, no exceptions, all animals, indeed, all life within the planetary biosphere. As noted, the original presentation was April 11th. That's now online if you didn't catch it, as are all the other sessions. This is the final discussion group. And as you can see coming up in May, this is a two-part series. Dr. Richard Waugh will be coming back to talk about glaciers, oceans, and our response. Now, we will be dealing a little with our response today, but that's primarily next session. And then in June, we continue with the economics. And if you ever have any problems, just go to the website. It's in every one of your emails, but there it is on the screen as well. So what we would like to do is just sort of to get our heads back into that space, because that's now 2 weeks ago. I mean, I can't remember anything from yesterday, let alone 2 weeks. But if you could put a brief response in the chat about what you remember from Dr. Waugh's presentation, two things in specifically. What was one new thing that you heard? We're always interested in what people are learning that's new. And secondly, what facts, figures, findings, or conclusions that made an impact on you. That is, you can hear something several times and it just sort of goes by, and then suddenly it hits you. So those two things, we'll just spend a couple of minutes on that just to see if there is anything. And then we'll move on from that point. Like I say, if there is anything like that, just put them in the chat and they will be read out. There's a couple of, oh, some people are remembering things very good.
The Antarctic Western ice field has already passed the tipping point, and we cannot stop the melting.
Probability is and not reversible sea rise of 10 feet. Changed everything, I think.
The areas of heat changes and increases.
We are already over the tipping points for polar ice melt and rising seas.
I think this one really made a big impact on everyone. That sea levels rise from ice over rock that melts. Sea levels do not rise due to ice floating on ice. Oh, sorry, due to free-floating ice that melts.
The accelerating pace of heat waves in Europe.
Okay. Um, like I say, we don't want to spend a lot of time on that. Oh, I see there's one more. Oh, no, still a couple more coming in. Definitely don't want to cut anyone off.
Heat of the heat effects worldwide.
That some of the ocean rise is due to thermal expansion.
That should read the extent of the heat effects worldwide.
The loss of agricultural land on the deltas.
Right. Wow, you people are a lot sharper than me. I don't think I could have remembered any of that stuff. Anyway, nicely done. If you think of some other things, by all means, keep adding them in there. What we will do now is our team as well. Now we did this beforehand and offline, so it's not quite a fair thing, but here are some of the key takeaways. And we're just going, I'm just going to go through them very quickly again to help refresh our memories. And if you think of anything else that triggers from this, by all means, add it into the chat. Okay, so the first thing was that we started with an actual church member from Fiji who is already being affected. If you remember, he talked about that already villages were being moved to higher ground. There was salty water that was seeping in and destroying agricultural land. And that they have this seawall, but it's old and starting to crumble, and it definitely going to need to be higher, even if it was in good shape, but it's not in great shape. And they're a poor country. They do not have the money for it, and so need international dollars for it. Rich talked about carbon justice itself, which is where rich nations, where globally a rich person is considered, I mean, it's just an average. Anyone with making over $13,000 a year, that puts you in globally the rich category. That rich nations made most of the CO2 and must help the poor nations who, of course, did not make hardly any of the CO2, but suffer most of the results. So that's the key carbon justice issue. He talked about global heat waves in numerous areas. The key ones, of course, we all know of the Western US ones. It was in our media every day, and Canada as well. Europe, and there was already mention of that problem, but he mentioned how a brand new issue, which was double heat wave. That is, they had one heat wave, and then completely separate from those dynamics, they had a second one within the same season. And then, of course, Australia, that made the news. Mid-Africa, probably never ever made the news. Russia got over 100 degrees Fahrenheit for the first time in Siberia. And I don't know that it made the news, but there was a massive, massive fire there as well. He also made a point that Europe has probably overall the best health care, and yet they found themselves swamped in more than one country and more than once. So even the best healthcare system that we have now can't even keep up with where we are now. And went on, this was new to me, that by 2100, now it was just the very bottom. It's not like all of Europe. It's just the very bottom tips of Europe, a chunk of Spain. I think it was Sicily and little bits of Greece, perhaps, that there will be desert there by 2100. That's kind of stunning to think of that. As already mentioned, there is this difference between terrestrial ice that will raise ocean levels. The two classic examples are Greenland, where one that has, of course, all kinds of glaciers, but he pointed to one glacier that in and of itself will raise the ocean over 1.5 feet. And Antarctica, as was mentioned again, the west sheet there is considered unstoppable now. And that, once melted, could take a century or so, will raise the oceans 10 feet eventually. The Arctic, at the other end, there will be no sea rise because that's just ice floating on water. For the most part, there are exceptions. But he brought in the high military concern. The military has been concerned for decades over this, as has, for instance, the insurance companies, for good reason, as you can imagine. But the military was the concern because in the Arctic, there will be ice-free summers, and with that is the exposure of oil, gas, and other minerals, and the possible, inevitable, probably, conflict over that. Though there are two places I have squiggly brackets, and this is one of them where I say, please, none. Let's make sure that our advocacy is strong enough to make sure there is no oil, gas, or mineral exploration. You may remember already in Alaska, there was plans to drill for oil in the Arctic, and that was at least temporarily stopped, and that's what we've got to keep doing. But that opens up, yes, whole military issues because everybody is scrambling to claim their stake. Ocean rise is also due to expansion, already mentioned. Of all the countries, Bangladesh is considered the worst because it's by and large a large delta. There are 18 million people for sure who will be affected. And again, similar to the Fiji situation, there will be a rice loss, great agricultural loss due to the salt water coming in. And he did, of course, as well mention US, New Orleans, and Charleston. Okay, we've known since the 1850s, Richard Gammon mentioned that, I think the fellow's name was Tyndale, if I recall correctly, who first discovered the greenhouse effect. So we have known for some time of this effect, and for sure, last century, 20th century, we have known how to fix it. So we have to reduce the greenhouse gas, but our whole, and this is the conundrum, our whole life is being based on the burning of fossil fuels. Virtually everything that we consider part of the good life is based on that. So the problem is a lack of will, and I'm always clear to separate individual and systemic, which he did as well, and the power of consumerism. And again, there's my second bracket, which to me all gets back to the conundrum of human nature. Which is actually quite critical and does separate out, in my opinion, But nonetheless, it's only my opinion, so I'll move on. Thus, it will only be fixed when our life dynamics change. In other words, technology can help, but cannot fix. So we need that full human scale change. So that's basically our summary of the key points. In some ways can be seen as extremely troubling, extremely even depressing at times. But that's that can also be seen as the challenge before us. And as Dr. Gammon originally said, we're digging a hole, we either dig it deeper or we stop digging and we start working our way out. And to help us with that, I'm going to now turn it over to Joan.
Thanks, Rod. In our first set of conversations last summer and fall, we focused on the sacredness of creation so that we could open our hearts more fully to the beauty and the wonder and the majesty of that creation. As we shift to impact and humanitarian issues, we're shifting our spiritual practice portion towards a different emphasis as well. It's 4 years ago now that in section 163 we were told that we must open our hearts, open our ears to hear the pleading of mothers and fathers in all nations who desperately seek a future of hope for their children. Do not turn away from them, for in their welfare resides our welfare. So we want to take a few minutes now to engage in a meditation practice to help us open our hearts more fully to our brothers and sisters and fellow sentient beings around the world. So get comfortable in your chair now. Take a few deep breaths and allow your breathing to take you deeper into a relaxed state. Relax your shoulders, all the muscles of your face, especially your jaw. Breathe in peace and calm. Breathe out tension and anxiety. Just let it all go. Return in your imagination eons of time backwards, all the way back to the Big Bang. A sudden bursting into being of creative energy. An outward sharing of the love and life-giving potential of God Almighty, creating time and space, cascading out into every part of this unfolding universe, filling it with the unconditional love, the light, the shalom of our Creator. And so it unfolded that we today live in a world entirely formed and crafted from that love, where every molecule originated from the very heart of God, sharing equally in the love and hope of God's unfolding creation. Picture it for a moment in your mind. The love and essence of the divine Creator, eternally showering forth like a fountain of love, giving life to every tree, every plant, every animal, fish, and bird, and to each and every human sister and brother living anywhere and everywhere in this world. Each one carrying within a part of the very essence of God. Each one beloved and essential to the whole. Picture or imagine that spark of the divine within you, perhaps glowing from around your heart or shining out of your eyes. Feel how beloved and sacred your life is, how precious, how unique. Imagine the arms of God reaching out to you, enfolding you, encircling you, wishing only to bless you with loving kindness, health, true happiness, and peace. And as you are enfolded within this embrace, notice how the circle is expanding, how there are others sharing this love and peace with you in this sacred circle. At first, you may notice one or two people you know, people you already love, wrapped with you in the love of God. And then others you know or know of, some of whom you might experience conflict and tension with, but nonetheless part of this sacred circle of love and blessing. Notice how this circle appears larger all the time, embracing all of life in your community, in your country, within this planet, our home. Notice the love of God shining from the heart and eyes of the young mother in Bangladesh with no food. From the majestic quiet and presence of the redwood forest. From the child soldier in Sudan. From the man burning forests in the Amazon to earn enough to feed his family. Or the young worker in the cane fields of Haiti, suffering through the hottest days ever recorded. That same divine love shining out of the young girl forced into sexual slavery because of persistent drought and crop failure. And the Colombian father dropping his children over the border wall into the US. Notice the constancy of that love, sometimes hidden or shielded from view, but never extinguished. Feel the connection of divine love that flows between and among all of our souls. May we all, each and every one of us, reawaken to our sacred connection with all that is. May we live lives of blessing for all creation. And there was evening and there was morning, all the days of the creation. And God saw that all of it together was very good. May we continue to expand the gratitude and the love in our hearts and minds, and look at everything and everyone with eyes of awe and reverence as we continue to create with God. And it shall continue to be good. Amen. Thank you for your willingness to journey into the sacred with us. In a minute, we're going to go into our breakout groups. We'll have 10 minutes to discuss the 2 questions up on the screen. And when we come back, have in your mind that when we come back, we'll be entering into a Q&A session with Dr. Waugh. And so if you are thinking of your questions as they come up, just go ahead and put them in the chat addressed to Susan or to everyone. So we're ready to go into our breakout groups now.
Okay, is everybody back? Looks like everyone's back. All right, we're going to begin now into our question and answer time. Yeah. So Rich, if you are ready, I'm going to be asking questions that we'll start with those that are left over from the webinar. Either the first couple are ones that you've already answered, but we've continued to have questions about them. And so I'm going to ask you to answer them all over again with whatever clarification you would like to give us. The first is, how much of the climate disruption is really part of nature and how much of it is human created? Can you address that for us? And you're still muted.
Thank you. It would have been a short explanation if I hadn't unmuted myself, right?
Yeah.
I think I'm going to pull up a diagram, which I think will help. So let me share my screen here, and let's go here. This is a great question, and this diagram goes a long way in helping us to see some of the patterns that we have seen in the past. What you have here is a graph showing.
So with the spotlight, we're not seeing the shared screen. So I just wanted to, there we go.
Should still be able to see the shared.
Is that, are you able to see it now?
No.
Not yet.
No.
I don't know, why are you not being able to see it?
Do you mind trying just unsharing and the resharing again, Rich?
Okay, and now sharing again. Whoops, It's not the right thing. Oh, I think it's going to have to give me a second, because I think what I did is I have to bring it up again.
No problem.
But at least we're seeing your computer now.
And your calendar.
How's that? Is that better?
We're still seeing your calendar right now, Rich. I think what you might need to do is, again, go to the very top of your screen and then tap stop sharing.
Okay.
There we go.
Is that it?
Now we see it.
Yep.
Because I was seeing I was seeing this diagram. I didn't know what you guys were seeing, and I don't know why you weren't seeing what I was seeing. But nevertheless.
This is great. Thank you.
So everybody's together now?
Yeah.
Looks good.
All right. So what you have along this, the horizontal axis here is time, with the present being right here, 0 years ago. It's right now, and going back in time to a little over 400,000 years. And what this shows on the vertical axis is the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere of the Earth. And the red line shows that distribution. And so you can see that there is a natural cycle, because obviously everything, almost all of this is pre-human, before humans had any impact whatsoever on carbon dioxide levels. And the red line shows that carbon dioxide will go down, and then will come back up, and then will go down and come back up, and go down and come back up. This tells you that when carbon dioxide is low, it's correlated with ice ages and glacial advances and so forth. And then when it's high, you're talking about interglacial periods between the ice ages, when the ice is melted back and so forth. So it's definitely tied to temperature as well. This is all a natural cycle, and it makes sense that, and you're right, that there is a natural cycle and so forth. And some people have argued maybe what we're seeing today is just part of this natural cycle. The reason why it's not is because you can note that at no time over these 400,000 years has this ever gone past 290 parts per million concentration of CO2. There is a natural feedback loops in the Earth system, which when it reaches approximately that level, it causes CO2 to start declining. And then it'll go back up, and it'll start declining again. And it goes back up and starts declining again, but it never goes past 290 parts per million. And in fact, we have this data going back now almost 1 million years. And in all that 1 million years, it's never gone past 290 parts per million. And there's been maybe as many as 12 or 14 of these cycles during that time. So what we're seeing now is over here is the red line has gone blasting past that 290 parts per million and has continued to accelerate. So now we're at, here's at 2021, we're at about 418 parts per million, which is considerably more than the maximum natural cycle we've ever had. So this is really good evidence. Pretty much everything that's happened past this black line, all of this is the human imprint, because that's all stuff that would not have happened naturally. This is all the human imprint. And what we've done is we've overwhelmed the natural cycle and have created a human-generated cycle, or concentrations of carbon dioxide, which will continue to increase. There is one scary scenario we can talk about, is by 2030, it's estimated that we're going to be passing through a critical threshold, maybe reaching as much as 450 parts per million by that point. And at this point, it will be increasingly difficult to address climate change in any kind of timely situation. So we need very much to be on this now. We needed very much to be on this for the last 30 or 40 years, but we haven't been. But we need to get on it now, because every moment we wait is just going to make it that much harder in the future. But anyway, everything past this 290 parts per million is excellent evidence that that humans have caused this. on top of the natural cycle.
Thank you, Rich. In your webinar, you mentioned that we know those historic temperatures going back, in this case, 400,000 years on your chart, but clear back 1 million years because of ice cores that have been drilled and examined. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role of ice cores in identifying what climate was like in prehistoric times?
Sure, I'll be happy to. And I have another graphic here, which I think will help with that. Ice cores are what they sound like. You're drilling into ice, and they generate these long cores of ice like this, which they are pulling up. And these cores are, as you can see, the guy's holding one here, is only 3 or 4 or 5 inches in diameter, something like that. What's interesting about the polar regions, and a lot of it's coming from Greenland, but also from Antarctica, what's really interesting about them, those areas, is they don't get that much precipitation. Just the precipitation they get never goes away. So it builds up and turns into ice. But for much of the year, there's little precipitation. And so what happens is atmospheric dust will fall and settle on the ice. And then you get a season of precipitation, and then you get a season where there's not so much precipitation, you get more dust. And what this creates is a series of ice rings. Some people have used as an analogy tree rings, which are annual cycles. But this over here shows the at a microscopic level, the dust levels, which are the darker levels of the ice level, and the dust levels and ice levels and dust levels and so forth. And what you do is each of those is a year. Each of these arrows represents 1 year of time that's passed, because you have a season of ice and a season of dust. What that does is allows us to date these things very carefully. You can just simply count back, these years. And what makes it particularly interesting is that when the ice was forming, there are small, very tiny little openings called vacuoles, which is this word right here, a vacuole, which traps. These are openings in the ice which trap the actual atmosphere current at that particular time. So if you had an ice ring that correlates to 200,000 years ago, you can do something called a microprobe analysis, in which you can actually directly measure how much carbon dioxide there is trapped in the vacuole 200,000 years ago. And this is not a proxy measurement. This is the actual atmosphere from 200,000 years ago. So the data is very good. And by calculating that kind of stuff, you then can generate pretty easily the kinds of diagrams like we saw. Oops, it doesn't. Let me go backwards. The kind of diagrams you can see here. That's how they generated these kinds of diagrams.
I see. So if there is a natural cycle that nature tends to kind of override the high temperatures and get things back in place, is it possible that nature will simply take care of this? If we just kind of get out of the way, nature can take over and right itself.
If we could snap our fingers, heaven forbid this would happen, but if we could snap our fingers and every human being on the planet disappeared, then
Okay.
which would be a horrible thing, obviously, but if that happened, then as time would go on, nature would indeed fix this problem. There would be no problem. It would find some new equilibrium based on the conditions of the Earth at that time, and those conditions would be more natural without the impact of humans. The problem is that human beings aren't going away anytime soon. That's not a problem. It's good, but with us on the Earth, the natural cycles can't exert themselves. They can't solve the problem, because we are creating so much carbon dioxide that those natural cycles are overwhelmed. They simply can't do what they would normally do. And so it's important to realize that ultimately in the long term, the Earth is not going to completely go away. Well, let's not go there. The Earth is going to end someday, but it's not for billions of years. So we're not going to worry about that right now. But the Earth is going to last. The Earth is going to survive. The question is how is it going to survive? In what form is it going to survive? What's going to happen to the animals and plants and ecosystems because of our actions? How are we constructing a human version of the Earth, which is not at all natural and is obviously can be very problematical for ecosystems, and of course problematical for human culture as well. So it's not possible for us to get out of the way unless we get rid of every single human being on the Earth, which is a horrible thing to think about and not obviously not a solution.
Rich, a question that's just appeared in the chat box, how do deniers respond to data like this? Do you know? I mean, have you any idea? Have you run across that?
I try not to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to respond to deniers, because at this point, there is so much data, there's so much outstanding science, there's so much truth out there, that to be a denier at this point means you are willfully being ignorant, and that you just truly are so consumed in ideology that you are not going to listen to anything that anybody says. So I assume what they are saying when they see this kind of data, when they hear these kinds of arguments, is that and often deniers are among those who deny that science itself is valid. At least this science is valid. So they would argue that the science that produced these curves is artificial, it's fake, it's not real, it's made up science, and it's just people trying to scare us or something like that. I can assure you it's not. The science here is outstanding, and it's solid, and it's absolutely true. But I suspect that's how they might respond to that.
Okay. For any of the rest of you, you can direct questions to me, Susan, or you can put them to everyone. It doesn't matter, and I'll try to pick them up in the chat box. I just wanted to answer one query that came there. Rich, concerning the Antarctic western ice sheet, if it's too late to stop it from collapsing, if it's past the tipping point, then what difference is our actions going to make? Is it too little too late? I mean, is this just a done deal and we should just throw up our hands and quit?
Yeah, I think so. No, I'm just, no, of course not.
Okay, well, there you go.
Let's go to this map here, which I thought we might get a question on this one too. So just to make sure everybody's clear exactly what's happening, this is Antarctica. It is a continent, so of course it's all underlain by rock. And the ice sits on that, and it sits on that at tremendous depths. Much of Antarctica has ice depths of over 2 miles. So we're looking at 11, 12,000 feet of ice in some cases. There's a mountain range that cuts through Antarctica and separates the West Antarctic ice sheet from the East Antarctic ice sheet. The West Antarctic ice sheet is the smaller of the two by a long margin, but even so, it's still very large. 530,000 cubic miles of ice, which is an amazing amount of ice. And it's the West Antarctic ice sheet, which several studies have shown has already reached the point where it is extremely unlikely that we'll be able to stop this from failing. And what does that mean? It means that the ice is going to continue to slough off and melt, go into the oceans, and it's going to do that for decades and decades to come. And eventually, it's not like the entire West Antarctic ice sheet is likely to fail at one time. That's not going to happen probably, but it's just going to continue to shed ice into the oceans, and it'll melt, and that will cause sea level rise. I want to make sure it's clear when indeed it is true that floating ice doesn't contribute to rising sea levels, but if it comes from the ocean, from the continents, like here, if you slough a glacier off the West Antarctic ice sheet into the oceans, then when it melts, it does impact sea level rise. Okay, so just to make sure that's clear. Now, this is taking a very long time. It's not going to happen in our lifetimes. None of us alive today will see the West Antarctic ice sheet, utterly fail or anything like that. We're looking at timescales of 200 years, maybe something like that. So, but this is going to go on, and it's very likely to be forever. So, what should we do about this? Should we just give up? No, of course not. There are so many things that we can do to help. If all of this ice does melt, it will raise sea levels about 10 feet. That will be catastrophic by itself. But if we work really hard, we might be able to keep other ice from melting, and that might keep the sea levels from rising 20 feet or 30 feet or 40 feet or whatever it's going to be. And all of those numbers would be far greater catastrophes, much, much worse catastrophes. So the fact that we may not be able to stop the West Antarctic ice sheet from collapsing at this point doesn't mean we shouldn't try to stop everything else as much as we can. And this is a time not to give up, but a time to redouble our efforts and to try to have a more positive influence on this whole situation.
So Rich, another really good question from our chat box is, what is your vision of a way of life that would really be sustainable?
Well,
outline that for us.
As you pointed out, I mean, I'll be talking about this some in the May talk, but I will give you some basic ideas that I have about this. I see two major prongs, two major thrusts of what we can do right now. And there's lots and lots of things inside each of those. One is that we really, all of us have to get really involved in restructuring the systems by which we live. And those are the economic systems and the political systems, cultural systems, and so forth. The way we live right now is what's caused the problem. We can't continue to live this way and assume that the problem is going to be solved, because that doesn't even make sense. You can't solve a problem by continuing to do the same thing that caused the problem. So we need to be very proactive about examining the kinds of systems which cause this problem. That means we may have to rethink economics. Almost certainly, I think it means we have to rethink economics. It means we have to be very, very conscious about who we elect to office. It is extremely important who we vote for. And we need to be very, very careful how our votes go, and to people who are committed and really dedicated to doing something about addressing climate change. This has been a real problem we've had for the last 30 years or so in this country. Cultural kinds of ways we assume are just the way things are may not be the way things should be, and we need to do something about addressing that. So the second prong of this is that each individual and each group, which could be a church community, or it could be a country or a state, needs to think very hard about how they can reduce their carbon footprint. Just how can we generate less carbon dioxide is absolutely critical. Technology will help, and there's going to be some good technological solutions to this, but it's not going to be enough. We have to actually change the way we live, and we have to think very seriously about our own individual response to this. What can we do, and what groups that we're part of, what can they do to help reduce carbon dioxide generation?
Okay, I've got a couple of questions about the possibility of another mini ice age occurring. It has been predicted by some scientists. And wouldn't that help reset this whole scenario if we had another mini ice age?
I guess I'm a little confused about what scientists are predicting a mini ice age right now.
The questions do not specify, but I do know that there has been some reports of a minor ice age in Europe, ice moving down over Europe. So perhaps you could talk about that.
Well, there may be
ocean currents.
Yeah, there's a possibility that there's one scenario that people have talked about where it's possible that Europe could actually get colder. Most scientists are not sure that's going to happen. They think Europe will actually get much warmer, much hotter, even than it has been for the last 15 or 20 years. But there is one scenario. I think I do have something here. Yeah, it's right here. Europe is warm because of the Gulf Stream, which is this warm ocean current which comes across here, which is bathes Europe in relatively warm water and makes Europe's temperature famously mild. Europe has tremendous weather in most of the continent, far better than you would expect, because as you can see, Europe is very far north. London, for example, is at the same latitude as Edmonton, Canada. And Edmonton, Canada does not have great weather, especially in the 8 months of winter. But why is London so much better? It's because of the Gulf Stream. And the scenario is that as the climate change is causing the ice, floating ice in the Arctic Ocean to melt, it's strengthening that cold water that's coming off of the melting ice is coming down on either side of Greenland in two different distinct currents, aimed right at the Gulf Stream and the North Atlantic Drift, which is what's keeping Europe warm. There is at least a reasonable chance, there's a possibility, at least theoretical possibility, that will cause cooling of the North Atlantic Drift, which would cause it to become more dense, change its salinity somewhat, and will cause it to dive. And that's what this diagram shows. It's going to break up this part of that and cause it to dive under the ocean and go to the south along the coast of Africa. If that were to happen, it would rob Europe of much of its warm ocean current, and Europe could get colder. Now, so far, there's precious little evidence that that's having any impact on Europe at all right now. In fact, the North Atlantic Drift is still functioning quite fine. And studies I've seen in Europe show that for every glacier that's advancing, there's probably 10 or 15 that have retreated or disappeared completely. So it's possible that there are some isolated anecdotal examples of glaciers advancing in Europe, but it's because of local conditions which would be unusual. The overwhelming number are retreating or in some cases disappearing entirely.
Okay.
So I'm not sure that at this point, I mean, scientists have been saying warming, warming, warming since about 1970. There's maybe a handful of iconoclastic renegades who don't agree with that, but that's the 1%, and 99% are saying it's warming. So I think that it's the old marching band analogy. If there's 100 people in the marching band and 99 are in step and one is out of step, it's a pretty good chance the 99 are the ones who are doing the right thing. So
thank you. We've got a question about the deterioration of carbon naturally. The carbon deteriorates naturally, but so does CO2. CO2, there's a cycle of it going into the atmosphere and then returning to Earth and all of that. So can you speak to us about that cycle of CO2 being naturally pulled out of the atmosphere, and then a UN report in February that stated that every country's climate plans, if they were met, would reduce emissions by 1% by 2030. Is that significant? So that's maybe two completely different questions, but they came in the same batch.
Yeah, let me address the carbon dioxide question first. I imagine everybody who's part of this webinar has, of course, heard of photosynthesis, which is so absolutely fundamental to life existing on the planet Earth that its Hollywood nickname is the equation of life. It is absolutely the fundamental equation of life. And this is the process whereby plants take up carbon dioxide and water vapor, and with energy coming from the sun, creates then carbohydrates and gives off oxygen. This is absolutely fundamental to everything that happens. This is where the oxygen comes that you and I are breathing that keeps us alive, as well as all the animals and everything else. And so plants, this is part of the carbon dioxide cycle, is that carbon dioxide is taken up by plants and transformed into oxygen. This is one of the reasons why deforestation can be such a serious problem. There's really two reasons. One is they often burn the trees after they cut them, and that puts carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But the other reason is the trees are absent then and are not able to photosynthesize and take carbon dioxide out of the air. This is one thing you can do if you feel like you want to try to make amends for traveling that you're doing, flying someplace. You can simply pay to have trees planted in equivalent to the amount of traveling that you're going to do. And the trees then provide some sort of balance for the carbon dioxide that you're going to be generating by taking it out of the atmosphere. So this has all been going on for long before humans were on the planet, of course. The problem we're seeing now is that because of devegetation around the world, and because of the massive amounts of carbon dioxide that we're putting into the atmosphere, is again that we've overwhelmed that system, and we've overloaded that system, might be a better way to put it, so that carbon dioxide levels are increasing. So before humans started all this industrial revolution stuff, the world was basically in stasis with the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It reached an equilibrium level. We have since disrupted that equilibrium, and the numbers are just going up now at this point. So the natural carbon dioxide cycle has been disrupted by human activity. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the second question. What was it?
Well, I kind of piggybacked. The second question had to do with a UN report in February that if all of the nations would meet their plans, we could decrease carbon emissions by 1% by 2030. What do you think?
And we need to do more than 1%, of course. I think that's an indictment of how inappropriate most nations' plans are. And this is one of the things that the climate summit, which just ended, I mean, it was virtual, so it didn't happen in any one particular place, but the United States called this climate summit at the end of last week with some really stringent new promises from the United States as to how we were going to reduce carbon dioxide levels. And that plan that we put forward at that point is way more than 1%. We're talking about 50% reduction by 2030. And country after country agreed that they're going to start doing that as well, or at least shoot for that goal. That's going to take a massive reorganization, and it's going to require the cooperation of citizens, which may or may not be available, but it is an extremely laudable goal. And so I think we're seeing that nations around the world are reaching the point where they are doing better than they have been in the past. Some nations have done a wonderful job. I mean, Germany is at 80% of the carbon dioxide they were generating in 1990. So, I mean, that was what, 1990, all those years ago, 30 years ago, they're 80% of that number. So they have done an amazing job of reducing climate change and carbon dioxide. And I should point out that Germany's got the strongest economy in Europe. So you can do that with a strong economy if you know what you're doing.
Okay. Rich, the politicians have, kind of gotten behind climate change. They're providing legislation for cap and invest projects and things like that. But they are not telling us that our lifestyle has to change. And yet what you're saying is that our lifestyle has to change. Why do you think the politicians are shying off of that?
Well, it's a natural thing for politicians to want to keep their jobs. I think all of us want to keep our jobs most of the time. I've had a few jobs in my life. I didn't really care if I lost, but for the most part, we want to keep our jobs, and politicians are no different. And voters tend to be, it's interesting how people think about the reasons why they vote. But one thing that will not ever work is if you tell somebody they have to make a sacrifice. They have to change something for what they perceive is the worst. That is not going to work. As far as I know, the only president I ever heard of that ever did that was Jimmy Carter, and he got annihilated in his reelection campaign, partially because of that. So politicians don't want to tell people stuff they don't want to hear. And they don't want to be associated with saying, okay, we can't have everything you want, because that's going to make people not vote for them. So some of those other things like cap and trade and so forth is things we could be doing, certainly, but those are Band-Aid approaches, basically. They're going to help, but they're just first steps towards a much more serious commitment to reimagining the world and building a new world is what we're going to have to do, because the world we've built over the last 300 years has caused the problem.
So, so if lifestyle change is the key, and yet we're talking about, reforestation and stopping deforestation, things like that. Can I pay for my lifestyle simply by promoting tree planting? Is it possible to offset my carbon dioxide simply by paying for my carbon footprint? Is that sufficient?
It's not going to be no. And the reason why is there's too many of us. We have created a world where trees are not welcome in most places. Because we need the area for agriculture or for cities or for whatever it is that we want them, golf courses or whatever it is. And so there just isn't simply enough room to do that. If we had massive forests, like amazing amounts of forests, it would help enormously in reducing CO2, but it's never going to be enough. It's just simply not enough to bring carbon dioxide down as much as we need to.
So is there a way, we're getting close to the end, and we've got far too many questions to handle all of them, so I'm kind of picking and choosing. You had talked about, or just mentioned the possibility of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere by mechanical means. Can that be accelerated? How feasible is that?
Well, there are a lot. It's called sequestration. A lot of sequestration is kind of a hot topic right now for a lot of people thinking about what they can do about this. And there's a lot of different ways of doing that. You can do it on a theoretical basis by simply saying, okay, stop bringing up the oil and gas. Leave it in the earth. Do not, even if you know it's there and you can make a ton of money on it, just leave it there. And what that does is it basically sequesters the carbon dioxide, the potential carbon dioxide that you'd get from burning it is sequestered in the oil in the ground, which just sits there and doesn't get formed. But there's other things too. There's a lot of chemical ways. There's one interesting approach that they're trying. They're doing some studies in Iceland right now, in which they're using Iceland's got made of a type of rock called basalt, and there's a way of having carbon dioxide react with basalt, which will take it out of the atmosphere, and then you have it in a solid form and you basically bury it, and things like that. And that's sequestering things. That's a mechanical way of doing that. And there's other examples too. I've seen ideas for like giant filtration systems and so forth. It's hard to see how we could have those big enough and common enough to really make a huge difference. But that's what some people are talking about. So it is possible to try to mechanically take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It's just that all of that requires energy. It requires a phenomenal amount of money. And it's going to require huge amounts of effort to get enough to make it, to solve the problem entirely. So while we should be, seeking out sequestration and other kinds of mechanical means, we should very much be thinking about lifestyle changes also, because it's going to take that as well.
Okay, last question, Rich, before we go on with our closing elements. It's hard to get a handle on how much impact each of our choices make. Yeah. Is there a way of quantifying the destructiveness of actions? Is there a concrete guide to help me make individual choices?
Yeah, I think the best approach here, if you want to know that, is there's all kinds of websites that will help you figure out your carbon footprint. How much carbon do I generate in my life? And then they often will then use that amount of carbon and say, and this has such an impact, so you can kind of get a feeling for that. There's lots and lots of data out there showing the impacts of climate change. I mean, the one which I keep coming back to, which causes me to blanch every time I think about it, is the World Health Organization is estimating that in the last year or two, each year, 150,000 people around the world have died specifically due to climate change. So we're losing 150,000 people a year, and that's a small number compared to what it's going to be. It's going to go up over the millions as time goes on. To me, that's makes me gulp when I hear about that, because it's a lot of people. And it makes me think that if there's something I can do to help keep that from happening, that would be a very good thing, So it's very difficult to take, for example, like if I drive 100 miles, how much impact will my gasoline burning have on the world? It's very difficult to come up with any kind of reasonable number or reasonable assessment of that, because everything's very complex and there's so much going on that those kinds of simplistic sort of procedures, although they can be helpful in helping us to see our impact, it's very difficult to come up with something like that in the context of hundreds of things that could be happening, So,
right.
But nevertheless, I think there is a lot of good quantification out there already. The impact on poverty rates, the impact on human deaths, and then of course the loss of animal species, which is going on at a remarkable rate. I will just throw this out. I know probably over time now, but there have been 5 previous global biodiversity crises in the world in which we had global extinction events. And all of those happened before humans were on the planet. We're in the middle of a 6th one right now. It's right now going on, the 6th major one. It's the same scale as those other 5. And this one is entirely being caused by humans. So when people say, oh, I wonder what those global extinction events look like, they're expecting fire and brimstone and earthquakes or volcanoes or something like that. I just tell them, look out the window. This is what it looks like. We're in the middle of one right now. And so we're having thousands of species going extinct because of climate change. And we have had for decades at this point. So that's another number that might give you pause and make you think about maybe what I could do to try to help prevent that.
And there's carbon calculators.
All kinds of carbon calculators. That's what I'm talking about. You know, the carbon footprint and carbon calculators. There's lots of those online. And it's not hard to get hold of one of those and find out where you're at with your own particular lifestyle, and maybe get some ideas about what it means and where you can go from there.
Thank you so much. You've been so helpful, and I appreciate that. We've got plenty of questions we've not gotten to, and we will make sure we get those to you. And we'll have a podcast where you can have a chance to answer some of those. And we also will see you next May.
Yes.
And some of these questions will fit into the kinds of things you'll be sharing with us about what we can do as individual and systemic. So thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You betcha. I'm happy to do it.
Thanks.
So before we get to our closing elements, we want to provide a blessing for each of you in our ongoing days and weeks and months. May we all, each and every one of us, reawaken to our sacred connection with all that is. May we live lives of blessing for all creation. May we continue to expand the gratitude and the love in our hearts and minds, and look at everything and everyone with eyes of awe and reverence as we continue to create with God. And as there will continue to be evening and morning, all the days of creation, it shall continue to be good. Amen. Over to you, Laurie.
So again, just our deep thanks. I think we all end up in this place of pretty internal quiet, trying to take this all in and let our hearts be broken for a world in need, as the hymn says. I want to invite you to continue finding the courage of being community together, learning and opening ourselves to these realities. Our next event will be May 16th with Dr. Waugh. Will be doing the large webinar again, and that will be followed by 2 more conversations. We'll be getting those dates out to you. And on June 13th, we have a guest speaker lined up who will be addressing one of those major places of systemic change that's needed and that is on economics. So get those dates on your calendar. Those are both Sundays at 2 p.m. Pacific time and 5 p.m. Eastern time, and 3 and 4 in between the West and East Coast. And I'm not sure what time it is in England, but I'm hoping that Andrew will figure that out. So as I close, we're coming back to the gift of this poem that says to me that grace is still at work in the world. And I'm going to be reading the first verse of this poem, which reminds us of the nightmares that come when we confront what's happening, as well as the hope of coming together. And then I have one last question for Rich. When we come to the abyss, when we come to this abyss, snakes, fire, midnight, hole, nightmares, whatever, down below, we know we must sing the old refrain of hope. It is only by singing out that we are heard. It is the raising of the voice It is the raising of our voices that changes the singer. As you go every day to the edge of what you know of yourself and then go beyond. There you will find others singing a familiar song, becoming a new way together. There will be no name for this new place until long after we, those of us here on this webinar today, for this new place until long after we are gone. But you feel it calling, praying you into being. Go, fly, do it now. I will join you. We will join each other. And so here's the last question. I'm going to do my Krista Tippett imitation. Rich, what gives you hope as you grapple with these major things that you have opened your heart and mind to for your professional life and over the years? You'll have to unmute again.
Sorry about that. I find hope in the realization that there's nothing mysterious about climate change. We know exactly what's causing it, and we know exactly how to fix it. None of that is mysterious. We know exactly what we need to do. And so it's not like it's some bizarre thing that we're just like, what do we do? We know what to do. We know exactly what we have to do. And I find a lot of hope in the realization that people are going to respond and do what they have to do, and that this will be fixed. I really think people are going to do that. I think there's lots of people already who are doing that. I find hope in this webinar, the colloquy that we're part of here. I find that of great hope. And there's hundreds, thousands of other initiatives like that going on in the world. So I really think there's a place for hope in all of this. I really do. And I think that people are going to, as people learn and people understand and people experience, they're going to start doing the right things, and we're gonna fix this, and it's going to be okay.
So with a deep breath and a lot of gratitude, we will see all of you and more. Invite your friends. Helping to get this word out. See you in May on the 16th at the same time, same station. See you then.
Okay.
Thank you all very much.